Every crime leaves a shadow. Welcome to the Dark Archive.
The first story was simple. That was the problem. On February 24th, 1986, 29-year-old Sherri Rasmussen was found dead inside the Van Nuys condominium she shared with her husband, John Rutan. They had been married only a few months. She was young, successful, and building the beginning of a life that should have stretched decades ahead of her. Sherri was not someone living on the edge of danger. She was a nurse. She had worked her way into a strong professional life. She was intelligent, capable, and loved by a family that would spend years insisting that the first version of her death did not make sense. But in the early hours of the investigation, the version that took hold was ordinary. A burglary, a break-in, a crime that had turned violent. The condominium appeared disturbed. Items were missing. There were signs that supported the idea of a robbery. Sherri's car, a BMW, was gone. For investigators in 1986, this gave the case a shape they could understand quickly. Someone had entered the home to steal. Sherri had interrupted them, and the burglary had escalated. That theory mattered, because once an official story begins to form, it becomes more than a theory. It becomes a path. Detectives follow that path. Reports are written around it. Evidence is interpreted through it. Witnesses and family members who point in another direction can start to sound, to the system, like noise. And Sherri Rasmussen's family had another direction. They believed police needed to look at Stephanie Lazarus. Lazarus was not a stranger. She had previously been involved with John Rutan before his marriage to Sherri. According to later court records and case reporting, there had been tension, jealousy, and unwanted contact. Sherri's father, Nels Rasmussen, reportedly told investigators he believed Lazarus should be considered. The family did not see this as a random burglary. They saw a personal motive. But that was not the story that stuck. The burglary theory remained the center of the case. The investigation did not lead to an arrest. No one was charged. And the death of Sherri Rasmussen, a young woman killed in her own home, became one more cold file. Years passed, then decades. This is one of the most psychologically difficult parts of a cold case. For the public, a case can become a name, a headline, or an old mystery. For the family, it does not age the same way. It remains tied to birthdays, anniversaries, photographs, empty chairs, and the knowledge that the person they loved did not simply disappear into history. She was taken from them, and the official answer was never enough. Sherri's family carried that doubt for more than 20 years. The case sat unresolved until 2009, when cold case investigators reviewed the old evidence with new tools and new questions. One piece of evidence became central: biological material collected from a bite mark on Sherri's arm. In 1986, DNA technology was nowhere near what it would become. Evidence could be collected before investigators fully understood how powerful it might one day be. That is one of the haunting things about old forensic files. Sometimes, the future is sitting in an evidence envelope, waiting for science to catch up. Years later, that evidence was tested. The DNA profile indicated the person who left it was female. That alone cracked the original story. A burglary theory built around unknown male intruders suddenly had a serious problem. The evidence suggested a woman had been in direct physical contact with Sherri during the attack. Eventually, investigators turned back toward the name Sherri's family had raised years earlier: Stephanie Lazarus. By then, Lazarus had become a veteran officer with the Los Angeles Police Department. She was not outside the system. She was inside it. She understood police culture. She understood investigation. She understood what detectives looked for, how interviews worked, and how a person was supposed to behave in a room full of questions. That is part of what makes this case so unsettling. This was not only a murder investigation that had gone cold. This was a case where the eventual suspect wore the same institutional identity as the people who had controlled the original record. In 2009, investigators obtained a DNA sample from Lazarus without directly confronting her at first. According to reporting and case records, undercover officers collected an item she had used and compared that sample to DNA recovered from the original crime scene evidence. The result connected Lazarus to the biological evidence. After more than 20 years, the case that had been treated as a burglary pointed toward an LAPD detective. Then came the interview. For many people who know this case, the interrogation is the moment they remember most. Not because it is loud, not because it is dramatic in the usual television sense. It is memorable because of how controlled it is. Lazarus is brought into a room with other detectives. At first, the conversation does not announce itself as a murder interrogation. It moves slowly, carefully. The detectives ask about the past, about John Rutan, about Sherri, about old relationships. They let the room stay calm. That calm is the horror of it, because the interview becomes a kind of narrowing hallway. Lazarus does not know at first how much they know. She does not know exactly why she is there. She is a detective herself, and that means she understands the shape of the room better than most people would. She knows when a conversation is not casual. She knows when questions are not random. But the detectives do not rush. They ask, they wait, they return to details. They let the pressure build through ordinary sentences. The interview has become famous because viewers can see the struggle between control and exposure. Lazarus tries to stay composed. She minimizes. She says she does not remember certain things clearly. She distances herself from the emotional weight of the old relationship. She pushes back against the idea that she had any reason to care about Sherri Rasmussen after so many years. But the room keeps getting smaller. Eventually, the detectives reveal that they are investigating Sherri's murder. The old case is not dead. The file has reopened. The past has not stayed where Lazarus may have believed it was buried. Later, Lazarus was arrested. The case went to trial. In 2012, Stephanie Lazarus was convicted of first-degree murder in the killing of Sherri Rasmussen. She was sentenced to 27 years to life. That conviction did more than solve a cold case. It changed the meaning of the original report. For years, the official story had pointed toward a burglary, a random crime, an interrupted theft, a violent stranger or strangers entering a home and leaving before anyone could identify them. But the later evidence told a different story. It suggested something personal, something targeted, something the family had been trying to make investigators see from the beginning. This is where the Rasmussen case becomes larger than the facts of one investigation. It becomes a study in what happens when an early official theory becomes too comfortable. The burglary explanation gave the case a familiar shape. It made the violence easier to classify. It gave detectives a category. But it also may have helped move attention away from a suspect who did not fit that first category. A woman, a former romantic rival, a police officer, someone inside the world of law enforcement. The case also shows the strange power of evidence that survives human failure. Memories change. Reports can be incomplete. Leads can be ignored. Bias can shape an investigation. But a preserved biological sample can wait silently for decades. That does not make the wait acceptable. It does not restore what was lost. But in this case, it mattered. The DNA from the bite mark did what the original investigation had not done. It forced the record to change. And when the record changed, the story changed with it. Sherri Rasmussen was no longer simply the victim of a burglary gone wrong. She was a young woman whose death had been misunderstood, minimized, or misclassified for years. Her family's suspicions were no longer just grief talking. They had been pointing toward a truth the system did not hold. That is one of the cruelest parts of this case. The family had to live not only with Sherri's death, but with the knowledge that the explanation offered to them did not fit. They had to carry the weight of a question the file had effectively closed. Who would want to hurt Sherri? Why was the case treated as random? Why did the warning signs not matter enough? And why did it take more than 2 decades for the evidence to be read correctly? Stephanie Lazarus's conviction gave the legal system an answer. It did not give Sherri back. It did not give her family the years between 1986 and 2012. It did not undo the long period when the wrong story stood in the place where the truth should have been. But it did matter. A conviction matters because the official record matters. A sentence matters because public truth matters. A name in a court judgment matters because it says this was not random. This was not unknowable. This was not merely a burglary that went bad. This was murder. And the person convicted of that murder had spent years inside the very institution that failed to solve it. That is why the Sherri Rasmussen case continues to hold public attention. It is not only because the suspect was an LAPD detective. It is not only because of the famous interrogation video. It is not only because DNA solved an old case. It is because the case exposes a deep fear people have about official stories. What if the first explanation is wrong? What if the people who see the danger are dismissed? What if the file closes around a theory that protects the wrong person? What if the truth is there, but the system does not want to look at it? Sherri Rasmussen's case eventually reached a legal resolution. Stephanie Lazarus was convicted. The evidence that survived from 1986 became the key that reopened the door. The family's long suspicion was no longer outside the record. But the case remains a warning. A first story can be wrong. A clean report can be too clean. And sometimes, the person who understands the system best is the person most able to hide inside it. This was not just a cold case. It was a case about how a record can fail, and how decades later, the truth can still be waiting in the evidence. If you're drawn to the psychological side of true crime, not just what happened, but what it did to the people left behind, you should check out my thriller novels. The Cross series blends dark psychological crime, horror, family secrets, buried evidence, and official stories that never tell the whole truth. Start with Bloodlines, Book 1 of the Cross series, at jamiefolsom.net. And if this case is holding your attention, don't forget to like this video and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it makes sure you know when the next case is published. A murder case does not end when a conviction is entered. Legally, a verdict can close a question. It can name the person responsible. It can correct the public record. It can say, officially, that what happened was not random, not unknowable, not simply a burglary that turned violent. But for the people left behind, justice does not work like a switch. It does not turn grief off. it does not return the years. It does not give back the version of life that existed before the door was opened, before the phone call came, before the first report was written, before the wrong story began to harden into the official one. For Sherri Rasmussen's family, the damage was layered. First, there was the loss of Sherri herself. She was 29 years old, a daughter, a wife, a nurse, a person with a future. That part matters because true crime has a way of turning people into case names. Once a case becomes known publicly, the victim's full life can get flattened into the details of the crime. But Sherri was not a plot point. She was not simply the woman in the Lazarus case. She had parents who loved her. She had a husband. She had a career. She had ordinary mornings and private jokes and future plans and unfinished conversations. She had a life that was violently interrupted, and every person who loved her had to keep living inside the space that interruption created. That is the first aftermath. The missing person at the center of every room. Then came the second injury. The official story. The first explanation given to the family matters because families build their grief around what they are told. If investigators say burglary, then the family is expected to grieve a burglary. If the file says random, then the family's expected to accept randomness. If the report points toward unknown intruders, then every other suspicion becomes unofficial, emotional, maybe even inconvenient. But Sherri's family did not believe the story was that simple. They had concerns. They had a name. They had reason to believe Stephanie Lazarus should have been examined more closely. And for years, those concerns did not change the direction of the case. That creates a very specific kind of psychological damage. It is not only grief. It is grief plus dismissal. It is grief plus the feeling that the people responsible for finding the truth have chosen the wrong door and locked every other one. For families in that position, time becomes strange. Years pass, but the case does not move. Life continues, but the central question stays frozen. The world expects people to heal, but healing is difficult when the wound is still being mislabeled. There is a difference between not knowing and believing the system refused to know. Not knowing is painful. Feeling unheard is something else. Feeling unheard can become its own kind of trauma. It teaches people that evidence may not be enough, that memory may not be enough, that family knowledge may not be enough. It teaches them that the official version of events can become more powerful than the people who lived closest to the truth. That is one reason this case still unsettles people. It exposes how much power there is in the first report. A police report can be clinical. It can be flat. It can sound neutral. But official language does not merely describe a case, it shapes the case. It creates the path investigators follow. It tells later readers what mattered and what did not. It decides which facts are central and which facts become background. In Sherri Rasmussen's case, the burglary theory did more than offer a possible explanation. It helped define the case for years. And while that theory stood, Sherri's family had to live with the feeling that something essential had been missed. Imagine what that does over 20 years. Every anniversary comes with the same question. Every memory is shadowed by the same doubt. Every mention of the case reopens the same frustration. The person they loved is gone, but the explanation remains wrong. And when the person they suspected is a police officer, the psychological burden becomes even heavier. Because law enforcement is supposed to be the place families turn when violence destroys their lives. It is supposed to be the system that takes chaos and gives it structure. It is supposed to preserve evidence, test theories, interview witnesses, and protect the record from fear, pressure, and bias. But in this case, the woman eventually convicted was not an outsider to that world. Stephanie Lazarus was part of it. That fact changes the emotional landscape of the case. It raises a question that goes beyond one person's guilt. What does it do to a family when the person responsible for the crime belongs to the institution responsible for solving it? That is institutional betrayal. Not in an abstract way, in a human way. It is the feeling that the walls themselves have turned against you. That the place meant to hold truth may have helped bury it. That the language of procedure, the calm of reports, the authority of badges, and the slow machinery of investigation can all fail if the wrong assumptions are allowed to stand. This does not mean every person in the system acted with malice. It does not require a grand conspiracy to wound a family. Sometimes the damage comes from tunnel vision. Sometimes from bias. Sometimes from professional comfort. Sometimes from the simple human tendency to prefer the explanation that seems easiest to file. But the result is still the result. A family waited decades. A murder went unsolved. A suspect remained free. And the record stayed wrong until the evidence forced it open. That is why the DNA mattered so much. In many cold cases, DNA is discussed like a plot twist, a scientific breakthrough, a dramatic reveal. And it is those things. But psychologically, DNA can also function as a witness that never got tired, never forgot, never softened its language, and never stopped waiting. The biological evidence from the bite mark did not care about the old theory. It did not care that the case had been filed under burglary. It did not care how many years had passed. It simply remained. And when technology caught up, it contradicted the story that had been standing in the way. There is something almost brutal about that. For decades, the family had suspicion, memory, concern, and grief. But the system did not fully move until the evidence could speak in a language the system was forced to accept. That is not a comforting lesson. It is an important one, because it shows how often families and victims know something before institutions are willing to validate it. It shows how often the emotional truth arrives before the forensic proof. And it shows how dangerous it can be when investigators treat family concern as noise instead of as information. When Lazarus was finally interviewed, the room carried all of that history, even if no one said it aloud. That interrogation is famous because it is controlled. It is almost quiet. It is not a movie scene with shouting and thrown folders. It is a slow tightening. But under that calm is a much larger weight. A family had waited more than 2 decades for the room to exist, for the questions to be asked, for the old story to be challenged, for someone inside the system to finally look at the person the family had wanted examined years before. That is what makes the interview so powerful. It is not only watching detectives question a suspect, it is watching the record begin to correct itself in real time. And still, correction is not restoration. A conviction can validate a family's long-held suspicion. It can bring a form of public justice. It can put a name where uncertainty used to be. But it cannot return the emotional life that was consumed by waiting. Late justice is still justice, but it is late, and lateness has a cost. The people who loved Sherri had to spend years living beside an official version of events that did not match what they believed. They had to keep saying, in one form or another, this was not enough. Look again. Listen again. There is more here. That kind of persistence requires strength, but it also extracts a price. Families in cold cases often become unwilling archivists. They remember dates. They save documents. They retell timelines. They learn procedural language. They become experts in the worst day of their lives because the alternative is letting the wrong story become permanent. That is a terrible thing to ask of a grieving family. And yet, again and again, families do it. They do it because the victim can no longer speak. They do it because the first report was incomplete. They do it because somebody has to keep the person from becoming only a file. In that sense, the Rasmussen case is not only about a murder. It is about the fight over memory. Who gets to decide what happened? The first theory? The institution? The family? The evidence? The court? The answer should be simple. The truth should decide. But truth has to pass through human systems. And human systems can fail. They can prefer clean categories. They can miss what does not fit. They can protect themselves from embarrassment. They can mistake certainty for competence. That is where the psychological horror of this case lives. Not only in the violence, not only in the betrayal, but in the years when the truth was close enough to name and still not officially held. The case also leaves a public lesson about how we talk about victims. It is easy, after a conviction, to make the story about the killer, the detective, the interrogation, the shocking twist of a police officer being arrested after so many years. Those elements are why the case travels online, but they are not the center. The center is Sherri Rasmussen. The center is a young woman whose life was taken. The center is a family that kept pushing against a version of events that did not make sense to them. The center is the damage done when a record is wrong and stays wrong for too long. That is the part that should remain after the video ends. Not fascination with the killer, not entertainment from the interrogation, but the understanding that behind every cold case is a family forced to live inside unfinished knowledge. In this case, there was a resolution. Stephanie Lazarus was convicted. The old evidence was re-examined. The DNA was matched. The court entered judgment. The official story changed. That matters. It matters deeply. But justice did not arrive in 1986. It arrived after Sherri's family had already spent decades carrying the weight of the wrong answer. So when we talk about justice in this case, we have to hold both truths at once. The conviction mattered, and the delay mattered. The truth was found, and the delay damaged people. The record was corrected, and the correction came far too late to spare the family years of uncertainty and anger. That is the shape of many cold cases. They are not only mysteries waiting to be solved. They are ongoing psychological injuries. They live in families. They live in siblings and parents and spouses. They live in boxes of paperwork, old photographs, courtrooms, interviews, and the quiet suspicion that something was missed because someone decided too early what the story was. For Sherri Rasmussen's loved ones, we can only hope the conviction brought some measure of peace. Not closure, exactly. Closure is a word people use when they want grief to become tidy. Real grief is rarely that polite. But perhaps the conviction brought confirmation, public truth, a corrected record, a place to put the blame that belonged there. And maybe, after all those years, that mattered. At the center is Sherri Rasmussen, a woman whose life mattered before the crime, during the investigation, and long after the file went cold. Her family deserved to be heard sooner. They deserved an investigation that followed every meaningful lead. They deserved a record that did not take more than 20 years to catch up to the truth. We remember Sherri first, and we offer respect to the family who kept her story alive when the official version was not enough. May they have peace. May they have dignity. And may the corrected record never again become smaller than the life it was supposed to protect.
If this case stayed with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps the channel grow, and it makes sure you know when the next case is published. And if you're drawn to true crime, cold cases, buried evidence, and the psychological damage violence leaves behind, check out my fiction series, The Cross series, starring Detective Avery Locke. Start with Bloodlines at jamiefolsom.net.